So, hello everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Now, with me today is Tory Bauman, who is the VP of Financial Planning and Analysis, FP&A for those of us that live that day in, day out of Zayo. So, I want to say thank you, Tory, for joining me on the show. Lovely to have you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me.
So, tell me a little bit about your current role, and then perhaps a little bit about your history. How did you end up at Zayo?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm the VP of FP&A at Zayo. We are a global telecommunications or communications infrastructure company headed out of Denver, Colorado. In my role, I'm in charge of a lot of the budgeting, planning, operationalizing of our budget, if you will, interfacing with our private equity sponsors. Zayo was once a public company. We were taken private in 2020 by two of the biggest digital infrastructure investors out there, EQT and DigitalBridge. I had an interesting journey throughout my career. I've always been close to Zayo. I actually am an accountant by education. I went to the University of Denver here in Colorado and went right into public accounting. I worked at KPMG for a couple of years in their audit department. I was in the TMT sector, which is tech, media, and telecommunications. Saw a lot of interesting clients through my time in audit. And I also realized how mundane audit can be sometimes. Stars is a really popular company that I think most people have heard of. They produce TV shows. It's a subscription based, and every year, you're auditing. Here's your number of subscribers times what they pay in their monthly subscription equals your revenue. It's not very complex. It's very repetitive, and Zayo was actually a client of KPMG's at the time. They were still a private company, so they were founded in 2007, and it was really a roll-up strategy in the communications infrastructure industry. The internet was created. The internet and mobile infrastructure runs over these fiber assets that run globally, either under the ground or in telephone poles. And there's a ton of metro fiber networks that were independently owned throughout the U.S. And Zayo really had the foresight in terms of connecting the globe, and they bought 46 or 47 of those independent kind of metro fiber networks, and they started connecting them across the US and then over into Europe. And so, if they acquired a network in Denver, let's say, and they acquired one in Chicago, they were building long haul routes to connect those two metro networks. So it was a really interesting time in Zayo's history. They were doing an acquisition almost every quarter, and with that, comes raising debt to finance those acquisitions. And so, as a young auditor, I wanted to be on that team. So I asked, my leaders at KPMG, hey, that client seems really busy. I think they needed some help at the time as well, and so I volunteered myself to join that team just to kind of get the exposure to that. I always thought going into transaction advisory at a big advisory firm was a career path that I wanted to take, and I thought that was good initial experience to be able to audit some of those transactions. After a couple of years, Zayo IPO'd. That was in 2014, so I was able to work on their S1 filing as an auditor. You spend a lot of time with the client during that type of process, and so I got to know the leadership team pretty well, especially the folks in the accounting group. And sure enough, about a year later, early 2016, I joined their team as a manager of SEC reporting. So after auditing their public 10Ks and 10Qs for about a year, I jumped over to the Zayo team, and I was preparing the 10Ks and 10Qs. So I was very familiar with the company, very familiar with the culture, which made it a much easier transition for me. I never thought, that I would be leaving Zayo after only a few years. I thought I had a little bit longer of a career path there. So that was a tough decision. I like to joke that leaving the Big Four, I'm sure a lot of listeners on this podcast can resonate with this, is kind of like breaking up with a boyfriend. You're like leaving your firm, you feel so torn. You kind of want to stay, but I'm definitely glad that I came over to the Zayo team and ultimately found my way into finance within Zayo. It wasn't a linear path either. I jumped around within the accounting department a little bit. I even left Zayo for about a year, and I ended up coming back into a finance position. So it's been quite the journey.
Absolutely, and that's that's both a journey for you as an individual, but also the organization's been on a massive journey. And and we get actually really enough. We've had a lot of questions and topic asks from our audience about that sort of that journey to IPO, and so it'd be interesting maybe to explore that topic. But fundamentally, that's a really interesting shift from IPO back into private. So what was that shift like for the finance team when you made that transition?
Yeah, I mean the shift from a very fast growing private company that was very acquisitive to a public company was a huge change for Zayo at that time. I mean, integrating all of that data, not only the network data and the customer data, but also all of the accounting processes, APAR, closing the books on a public company timeline, something very different than what we were managing previously. And so, really getting those systems and processes in place to do that while continuing to acquire companies, I would say was one of the biggest challenges for Zayo at the time. Definitely, I think going from public to private, there's definitely a little bit of a change in mindset. But it was nice to have the tools. We have some great on-time reporting that we're able to give our private equity investors. We're always striving to shorten those close periods and get more insight into our numbers even before the books officially close. But I know, and a lot of companies go through that private to public transition. The SEC filing requirements and the deadlines that come along with that can definitely carry a burden for the teams.
And obviously, you've been on both sides of the fence, so you've looked sort of looking over as an auditor what was going on. So, like, what advice do you have for those that are maybe considering an IPO in the future, in the next couple of years? Like, what is there anything that people can do to help sort of prepare themselves well for that kind of event?
Yeah, absolutely. I think understanding the reporting requirements, especially specific to your industry, is really important. There's been a lot of accounting guidance changes. I know there's some big RevRec changes that occurred kind of in the 2018 timeframe. Understanding those and really getting yourself set up in a system to run those as smoothly as possible is the biggest benefit. We had to go through some of those transitions as a public company and adhere to those transition reporting deadlines that the SEC laid out. And so, really altering our systems, implementing new systems, getting our data prepared to be able to report in that manner. It's a big lift for the teams, and it's all while they're doing their day-to-day jobs, right? So the more that you can understand maybe what changes in reporting are coming, if you are transitioning from a private company to a public company, and getting yourself really set up for those is key to being successful in that transition.
And in your I guess your role on both sides of the fence, I'll keep referring to that because it's a really interesting perspective, having looked at the company from two different lenses. But when it comes to balancing the need for speed and information versus the I guess the public requirement for making for compliance and making sure things are accurate, how did Zayo as an organization balance those two different needs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, accuracy is definitely our priority. We want to get it right. We want to be reporting accurate results. We don't want to put any misleading metrics out there. And so, morphing our timelines and our systems to meet not only the timing requirements for the filings, but also obviously the accuracy is very important to us. And so, you kind of look at it with that lens and walk backwards from there and say, who do we need on the team? What kind of systems we need in place in order to do that? And our auditors have honestly been very helpful in that. I know sometimes it can be a little bit of a push and pull with auditors, but obviously they're very smart. They know the rules. They see a lot of other companies struggle through transitions like that, or even manage successfully through transitions. And so they're honestly a great resource to kind of lean in with and figure out what have you seen work in other places, what missteps have you seen that we should be thinking about that we can get ahead of. So as much as it pains some people to talk to their auditors, they really are a wealth of knowledge and a good resource to use, especially for a transition like an IPO.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Use them to your advantage rather than seeing them as a chore that you need to deal with.
Exactly.
And I guess that's a good question for you. As somebody that's been an auditor, like what are some of the things that are really, used to really frustrate you on the other side? How can other firms get more out of their audit teams?
Yeah, I think I have experience in both sides. You're on the audit team, you're working, endless hours during an audit. You have a ton of requests out to the client, and a lot of times, you're not getting back what you requested, or you're getting back something that's not what you asked for. I think on the flip side, I've been in situations where I'm getting requests from my auditor that don't necessarily make sense for our business sometimes. And so I think making sure that there's open lines of communication and both groups understand this is the goal. This is why we're pulling this information as an auditor. This is what we need to validate. And at the same time, the business understanding, what that goal is, and maybe there's a different way to approach the data. The auditor doesn't know your business inside and out necessarily. They just know what they need to sign off on. And so if you can work as a team and say, hey, this is really how the business operates. I think we should be looking at this set of data or validating it this way, and getting them comfortable with that, and helping them really understand your business processes goes a really long way, especially during kind of that busy audit season when there's a lot of requests flying around and there's a lot of data being sent back and forth.
No, absolutely. I'm a big believer in that if you can enable your auditors and give them access to systems and allow them to self-serve, I don't think anyone enjoys chasing somebody for the copy of a purchase invoice. That
Yep.
can't be. That is definitely a thankless job. So I'm a big believer in that shift to digital audits. So we've talked a lot about your your past and your history, but tell us a little bit about your role now. How have you been in that FP&A role since since you've been in the private aspect in private equity, or were you there in the public aspect as well?
Yeah, I was there in the public aspect as well. So I did some SEC reporting, technical accounting roles at Zayo while we were public for a couple of years. I actually went into more operational accounting. I was Zayo's assistant controller. When that role came around, I was sitting outside our CFO's office of that business unit, and he said, "Hey, I'm hiring an assistant controller. I want you to be in that role." And I said back to him, "Yeah, that all sounds great, but I don't want to be in accounting forever. I actually want to be in finance. I don't really want to do that." And we had a discussion about it, and it was definitely a step up for me at the time. It was progression in my career for sure. And he said, "Look, let's put you in this assistant controller role for a year, and 1 year from now, let's see, what the business looks like, and see what kind of roles are available in finance." And sure enough, things at all companies, but especially at Zayo, can change on a dime, given how many acquisitions we do and just the changing landscape in communications infrastructure. And sure enough, a year later, we acquired the Spread Network, which, if you haven't heard of it, it's a really interesting network. They actually wrote a book about it. It's called Flash Boys, and it's a network that goes from the Chicago Stock Exchange to the New York Exchange. And there's traders that will pay for the highest frequency on that route. And so they built it in secret, actually, and they built the most direct route. If you just drew a line on a map from Chicago to New York, they had to drill through all the mountains in Pennsylvania, and it was super expensive to build, but they can charge at the time, a huge premium for finance companies that wanted that extra millisecond of speed on that route. So we had acquired that, and the business owner of that segment in a staff meeting said, "Hey, I'm looking for a finance director. If anyone knows anyone who'd be good for the role." And sure enough, my boss said, "Hey, I have Tori on my team. She's really interested in getting to finance." And so that was definitely a turning point in my career. I always tell people who are, kind of coming up in the careers, don't be shy about telling people what you want to do. If I had taken that role and I kind of kept it to myself that I wanted to be in finance, that would have never crossed his mind in that meeting to say, hey, I think Tory would be interested in that. So that definitely has opened doors for me. I took that role, and as with any company, we've been through a few reorganizations within finance, but ultimately I landed in this VP of FP&A role today.
Oh, wow. And what does, obviously you're in an incredibly fast growing and acquisition hungry organization. What does FP&A look like in that environment? What does the day job involve?
Yeah, it's definitely not boring. We obviously do the annual budgeting processes, updating the forecast. We do that on a quarterly basis, helping the business kind of understand where they measure up against their targets. But whenever we're in the process of looking at an acquisition target, even divesting in certain assets that we own, we always say we're a buyer or a seller for the right multiple. So we've both acquired companies, we've carved out segments of our companies and sold them off. We are part of the diligence process in some cases. So helping put together, the M&A underwriting model. We think between these two companies, we can create, X synergies, either from a network expense perspective, a headcount perspective. This is what we think we can save when the companies are integrated, and helping put together those models. And then especially once the acquisition is complete and finalized, integrating their targets really into our budgets and helping, our teams understand where that falls within their organization, what incrementally has been added to their targets via this acquisition, and what that means for them in running their business segment.
And how, when you obviously working in acquisitions, where do you see the success with acquisitions? How do you figure out what's the right fit for you as an organization, both financially, but is there a cultural aspect to some of the things that you look at as well?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think early on, when Zayo was kind of amalgamating all of these fiber networks together, it was all about the assets, right? We wanted the footprint in every major metropolitan area. We wanted to connect all of them so we could have, cross-country service for the big hyperscale companies, the big carriers, the household names you think of, like Meta, Apple, Uber, AT&T, Verizon, all those companies that operate nationwide and worldwide. And so it really was about, how does this network asset fit into our existing portfolio? We own over 17 million fiber miles today across the globe, which could wrap the earth several times if you straighten them all out. So it's a huge footprint. I think our strategy has shifted a little bit in the last couple of years, especially since we've been private. Now that we have all these assets, it's really about how do we sweat the assets and grow organically, while doing maybe some tuck-in acquisitions or capability acquisitions just to complement what we already have. And so I think culture has definitely become a much more critical component of that. In the last couple of years, we've done 2 capability acquisitions. And what I mean by that is we acquired companies that provide a service that Zayo was not able to provide previously. So one of those acquisitions was ENA, Education Networks of America. They have a phenomenal team that provides mainly dedicated internet access to about 20,000 schools across the US. They mostly operate on a leased network, meaning they don't own any fiber assets in order to provide that service. They'll lease the fiber needed to grant those schools access. And so we've been able to realize some synergies there. Now we have that capability of selling into these schools and other government agencies while using Zayo's footprint to provide that service. Another one we did was QoS, which is a SD-WAN or edge service. The technical side is way over my head being a finance professional, but think about when you go to like a PetSmart and you go to the checkout and they type in your member number and you could be in any PetSmart in any location across the globe and it'll pull up your account. That's kind of a managed edge solution, managing some of the IT components for that organization. And again, they didn't own any network, but they had that capability. And so instead of kind of standing up as a new product at Zayo, we were able to go acquire a company that already had the expertise to be able to run that for us in our business.
And do you think that change in strategy is about the current economic climate, or is it more driven by your sort of development as an organization? So you got into that point where you needed to make more out of those assets?
It's a little bit of both, right? I mean, and our world is really so connected, and there's so many companies that really want these end-to-end solutions. They don't want to manage multiple vendors, one that has the fiber connectivity in one metro and a different company that, has fiber connectivity in a different city, maybe where they have two big corporate campuses. And they also want the internet access and the managed edge service. They don't want to go to 6 different vendors to provide that. So Zayo likes to look at it as a stack of products and taking the customer kind of from the bottom of the stack all the way up to the top, to kind of meet all of their IT requirements, is something that we think is invaluable in our space, and really puts us ahead and gives us that competitive advantage.
And one of the things I always find interesting when I'm speaking to people that are working within private equity is the pace within private equity. I was joking with somebody who was just saying 12 months in private equity is like 3 to 5 years anyway in any other kind of organization, just the amount that you get through. So how do you guys manage to when you made that shift from public to private equity, what was the pace change like internally, and how did finance sort of gear up to meet that or match that pace, I should say?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think as a public company, there was a lot of market pressure on Zayo to grow. And so I don't think as an organization, we really felt a big shift in pace with our private equity sponsors. I think, the quarters, I remember being so stressful, hitting those quarterly targets to meet market expectations was huge, especially on the sales team, on the whole organization, just to succeed every quarter, right? I think making that shift from public to private, we have 2 pretty incredible equity sponsors. They know the space really well. They have a ton of other investments in digital infrastructure and in tower companies and data centers and things like that. So they really know kind of the core of how digital infrastructure operates. We were able to work with them actually on a long-term plan that required some transformation and automation in both finance and in our service delivery operations, our sales department, really getting the underlying systems geared up for that organic growth. And so it really has been a partnership. There's no shortage of, data requests and reporting up to our private equity sponsors. But I think having a little bit of a longer term investment concept versus the public markets has actually really helped in letting Zayo kind of align its strategy, align its business processes and systems with that strategy to kind of get the engine going.
Yeah, because I think that's always the challenge, isn't it? It's always about the next, the next time you have to speak to the city and talk about the forecast. So I can completely understand that interest. And it's interesting that kind of the pace itself was always there, and actually it's just it's thinking more about the investment cycle versus the requirement there. So. And from your perspective, obviously you talked about your journey, and you've obviously come from Audit and then into Zayo, but then you bounced out for a period. And we talked just before the podcast about the concept of a boomerang employee. So tell us a little bit about that. And was that you in that role?
Yeah, it was an interesting time for me. So we were taken private in March of 2020, which was like the first week of COVID, literally.
Wow.
Our close date was in March, and everything was just shutting down around us. We weren't really sure what was going on. And I had been home for probably 8 months or so. And, through that, it was a struggle for a lot of people to figure out, you're not going to the office anymore. You're at home all the time. I call it my midlife crisis, because I was kind of looking around at, my boss at Zayo, others on the leadership team in finance, and thinking, why am I doing finance? Like, do I even like this? Like, maybe I should have studied marketing. Like, I was going down all of these rabbit holes that had nothing to do with what I had done in my career at the time. And I was in my late 20s, and I was just thinking, man, I've invested all of this time into a career in accounting and finance, and I don't even know if I like this. I don't even know if I want to be here. And it was a challenge for me. And so I came across an opportunity to go work at a very small startup in the pharmaceutical industry, but their business model wasn't so different from Zayo's. They wanted to uh, roll up a bunch of small mom and pop compound pharmacies into a bigger brand like a CVS, if you will. I was the fourth employee and the only finance employee at the time, and we started acquiring companies. We were private equity backed, so it wasn't dissimilar to what I had just done, but on a much smaller scale. Zayo, we do $2.5 billion in revenue. This company that I was going to had $0 in revenue when I started. So it was a lot different. I did that for a few months, and I decided, this is not for me either. Maybe it is financing. I don't want to do that. I was working with a career coach at the time that I had just started working with to kind of dig through some of this uncertainty that I was feeling. And that was a real turning point for me. She gave me a lot of confidence that, it wasn't the finance that was the issue for me. I definitely did a lot of work, personally, internal kind of struggles. That's something that I go through a lot. I like to ruminate as a human. I think a lot of people can relate to that, but I think I was just letting that get the best of me at the time. And so I worked through some of that with her. I ended up going back to this startup, to my other three partners, and saying, hey, this is not long-term for me, but I'm willing to work with you guys on, the diligence side, or do some consulting for you in the meantime. But I know I don't want to be here long-term. And so I actually started my own consulting business. I started going out and picking up clients, mainly through word of mouth and just putting it out on LinkedIn. I was shocked at how many people said, hey, I need help with accounting or finance. And across a lot of industries, I helped a hard kombucha company. So in the beverage industry, I managed the finances for a band for a little while. So it really opened a lot of doors to new experiences for me. I met a lot of incredible people. And then about almost a year later, Zayo said, hey, I heard you're consulting. Will you consult for us? So I picked Zayo up as a client. I already knew the business. I had been there almost 7 years before I left. And it was going really well. I was learning a lot. I guess one thing I didn't realize working, at a bigger corporation and then moving into consulting or being on my own was, you don't have one boss anymore. You have, 12 bosses, and you don't have as many resources that are readily available to you. If you have a question about something in finance or not, at a larger company, you just pick up the phone or get on your Slack messaging or GChat and ask somebody, ask your boss or ask a peer. You don't have that when you're running your own consulting business. You get on Google, right? Or maybe ChatGPT, and you try to figure out, how do I do this or that? So that was definitely a learning and growing experience for me. Zayo actually had a position open up in finance, the role I'm in now, and they said, hey, will you just come back? We kind of miss you. And given the fact that, Zayo had those resources, they have mentorship programs, like all of these career building things that I didn't really have on my own. Well, it was a lot of fun and really interesting to do kind of that consulting piece on my own. I did miss kind of the bigger company culture and everything that comes along with that, and the opportunity it brings too, right? Like, we're working on refinancing our debt stack, which we have a maturity wall in a couple of years, and we need to figure out, how we're going to replace that. And so over the next several years, we're going to go refinance billions of dollars of debt, right? Like, that's not something I would have been able to do on my own. or really had the opportunity to do. So I get really excited about things like that. And I'm definitely glad I'm back at Zayo. I've been back since basically January of 2022. So I was gone for pretty much, let's see, maybe 14 or 15 months and boomeranged right back. So I tell people, if you're ever thinking about leaving Zayo, don't do it because you're going to miss it and you're going to come back.
And do you think, obviously, I genuinely feel like COVID was a real eye opener for a lot of people. It made people do, both things that they wouldn't have done in any other circumstances. I think both good and bad, right? And we can talk about that. But do you think that and have you seen people sort of shift away and come back to different organizations in the different conversations that you had? Do you think the boomerang piece is a bit of a trend that's happening?
I do. And honestly, there's quite a few of them at Zayo. I'm not the only one. So I think
you need a sticker. You need some kind of, I'm part of the boomerang
right?
club.
Exactly. I don't know. I think it's always easy to think that the grass is greener somewhere else. Definitely when you're in your current seat. And I don't think it's bad to go exploring other opportunities and see what's out there and see what is the right fit for you. But I think being able to boomerang and leaving yourself in a good position if you do decide to try something different and leave your current company, leaving things in a good place, is important because there's always that chance that you might miss it, you might want to go back, or there's other opportunities maybe at that same company that weren't available to you before but are now. And it's a little bit easier to step back into something that's familiar, kind of know what to expect, than kind of continue down a path of always trying something new.
And, how do you personally identify and decide on what's the right opportunity for you? You mentioned using a career coach at different points, but how do you figure out which opportunities to say yes to and which ones to pass by?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think, ever since I started my career, I always had high career aspirations. Um, you know, the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years, gets asked a lot in interviews or with your mentors or in performance reviews, and it's always a hard question to answer. I don't truthfully believe that anyone really knows what they want to do in 5 years, but I would always tell everyone, I want to be a CFO. And what do you think I should be doing to get myself there, or what gaps do you think I have in my experience? And obviously, as a young person starting an audit, I didn't really have any experience yet, so I think building that foundation as an auditor was really important, learning kind of how businesses operate, the fundamentals of reading financial statements and things like that. Most recently, I was in a discussion with what one of my bosses or mentors, and I asked, if I want to be a CFO someday, what are my blind spots, or what am I missing on my resume? And he said, well, I think you need capital markets experience. And luckily, we're sitting here 12 months later, and we're looking at going and refinancing some of our debt stack. So I'm getting some of that exposure to talk to bankers and things like that. And because we were having those discussions, he's like, hey, I should put Tory on this project so she can, get some exposure to this. And she can have that kind of on her resume going forward. So I think having maybe a vague goal in the future, like CFO, or something out there that you think maybe you can attain one day, is important. And it's important to say it out loud too. Don't be embarrassed about your aspirations. It's also okay to not want to be a CFO. It's definitely, not the most glamorous, even though it might seem that way. So just being honest with kind of the people who are around you who can help get you there. I have worked with a career coach, although I will say they're really good at getting stuff out of you, maybe that you didn't think of before, or maybe that you even didn't think you can do. That was a big turning point for me. Like, it comes with all the anxieties and pressures, and it can be hard, but they're not really advising on, hey, I think you should do this down the road. They're really digging deep down kind of into what you want, and asking you some hard questions. So I definitely think that was a turning point for me in my career. It was really invaluable for me to go through that.
No, absolutely. I think sometimes just talking to somebody that's outside and I guess independent from the decision that you're making, because I think even with close friends or people, colleagues, etc., that they've all got some small or big vested interest in the decision that you're making, and sometimes it's nice to have that independent viewpoint. I think that's the best thing as me as a consultant, is that I come into conversations and there's all this history and this politics around the decision, and you don't know it. And there is something about having someone facilitate that conversation. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it works in all aspects of life, not just process systems, but also careers as well. Um, so obviously, we've talked a lot about careers and choices on this podcast, and I guess what questions would you recommend that people ask themselves when thinking about whether the step that they've been offered, the choice that they've been offered, is the right one for them? What sorts of things do you think about when those interesting opportunities come up?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's all these kind of rabbit holes you can go down when you're asking yourself those questions and trying to figure out, what is the next move that's going to set me up the best in my career, or, what am I going to get the most value out of? And I think people a lot of times forget about the enjoyment of it, and looking at, well, where am I going to have the most fun, or what am I going to enjoy the most? And a lot of times I think that's where you get the most out of those roles, is choosing the one that you're actually going to like. um, there's been times where there's been roles that are, yes, that would seem like a great career progression role for me, but I would hate doing that. Like, I don't want to spend all my days and time at work in that position and doing that specific kind of work. And I think on paper, like, yeah, that might have gotten me a couple steps ahead of either staying in my current role or moving into something different. But I don't know that I really would have gotten all that far because I wouldn't have liked doing it. And so I think it's really important to evaluate your life in general. Like, am I going to wake up and enjoy doing that every day? Am I going to like going and working with that team every day? What impact is my work having on the organization or something else that I'm going to be proud of? And I think that's really when you scale the most in your career, is when you're having fun. You're working at it, you're waking up and you're really putting all of yourself into it, as opposed to, I'm going to go slave at this other role because maybe the job title is one tier higher than what I'm doing now, or, it's everyone's in a rush to get there, right? So just taking a step back. Careers are long, right? Nothing happens overnight and nothing's linear. So really just taking a step back and thinking about what you want to do personally, and what you'll enjoy the most.
Yeah, and I think the days of it being a straight path to CFO have really changed. And actually, what organizations are looking for is this really well-rounded individual that has lots of experience across the board. So, and certainly the conversations I've had with recruiters and those that have managed to step up into that role, there's been a lot of that. So thank you so much, Tory, for sharing your experience and the journey, obviously, that Zayo's gone through. If anyone wants to know more about Zayo and what you guys do and the journey, where can they find out more?
Yeah, go to Zayo.com. It's a very interesting company. I can pretty much guarantee that the listeners on this call have ridden the Zayo network when they sent a text message or made a phone call or sent an email. So we're mission critical to a lot of things and most people's lives. So go check us out, learn about us on Zayo.com, and thank you for having me.
Oh no, it's been an absolute pleasure. And guys, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. As usual, the way we assess how the rating of the podcast is obviously your reviews and your feedback. So if you've got questions that you think I should have asked, feedback on the content, or anything that you feel like I could do better, constructive criticism is always welcome. Please do reach out or leave a review on the podcast if you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much, Tory, and thank you to our listeners for joining me today. And we'll see you next time on the CFO 4.0 podcast.